Hey there guys, alright, today we are back on our potential history video. This time we're finally on to the minor Axis tank meme. We still have a few tank memes to go. I believe we still have the Soviets. There were a couple others that I forgot the names of. Forgot the two others. But I saw them when I was checking out what I should record for today's video. But anyways, let's go ahead and just dive right into the video.
You know?
Yes. My name is Frank Grimes.
I'm Lenny. This is Carl and Homer. I'm Lenny.
How do you do?
Wow, you got pencils with your name on them.
Those are fucking Hearts of Iron sound effects. Giving me PTSD.
Just like a pencil company executive. I'd give anything for one of these.
Any office supply company can have 'em made up for you.
Can I have this one?
No.
Can Lenny have it?
No.
Ah. Simpson, do you know who chewed my...
What the fuck is...
Major powers tanks of World War II, I've gotten a lot of requests to cover many of the minor and more forgotten countries' tanks used during the conflict.
Oh my
and although
God.
their involvement and numbers were limited, I like to think myself a true man of
Thank you for watching my videos, Your Majesty.
the people
I am once again.
and want to give them what they want. So this will be the
Goebbels.
penultimate episode in the series, not counting the wrap-up video, focusing on the tanks of the minor Axis allies. And a fair warning, it's difficult to find footage of minor Axis nations' soldiers, let alone their tanks, so prepare for a lot of stills and general as close as possibly related footage. The minor Axis allies, unlike
Understandable.
the countries of the allies themselves, were at many times in a strange sort of limbo between a true alliance and a sphere of influence working towards common goals. It's not a big secret that the Axis powers did not work together in the most effective way possible. In
Oh,
fact,
yeah.
in some circumstances, between the big three, you could even argue that they worked in opposition of each other from time to time, and the minor nations were no exception to this. The minor Axis nations were an attempt by Germany to restore the old Austro-Hungarian alliance from the Great War back to practice as best as possible. But the nations within were not given the same respect and trust as true allies would be given, and were often treated more as pawns in service to German interests and kind of a bulwark against the USSR. Many of the countries within the sphere did not get along well, with old rivalries flaring up, making for a very complicated web of groups to help in subduing the Soviets. And with the countries being small and lacking in a lot of heavy industry, you will probably begin to see some common factors emerge as we rapid fire through these.
Alright, we got the Croatians, okay.
Croatia
What you
broke
bringing to
off
the
and
table,
declared
Croatia?
independence from Yugoslavia at the onset
Amaze
of
me.
the German invasion, and only got a small portion of the very small Yugoslavian armored force. Upon Yugoslavia's defeat, Germany permitted its formal formation and recognition. Although it would be expected that the remaining of the Yugoslav tanks would have been handed over to them, most were seized by the Germans except for a handful of French FTs and R-35s purchased before the war. However, later, the Italians and Hungarians agreed to provide some AFV assistance, with small numbers of L3 tankettes handed over. Croatia's main role in the war was
War crime.
anti-partisan activities. However, they did send volunteers to the Eastern Front, most notably guarding the flanks around Stalingrad, and as time went on, acquired a hodgepodge of whatever tanks they could beg, borrow, and steal, including 4 Panzer Is, 16 Polish tankettes, a handful of Panzer IIs and IIIs, and 15 H-39 and S-35 tanks by 1944. And they were generally divided among new established rifle and mountain brigades, with the largest single acquisition of tanks coming from vehicles left behind by the Italians when they exited the war in 1943, followed by a few late models of Panzer III and IV used against the Red Army in 1945. The vehicles never amounted collectively to more than a few armored battalions and did not change Croatia's war fortunes in any significant way.
Alright, Slovakia. Dealing with the
Slovakia was the
Yugoslavian
first minor
region
nation
first.
to join Uncle Hitler's wild ride after gaining independence following German annexation of the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia. A fascist state was set up in March of 1939, and an army was created from the materials of the former Czechoslovak army, inheriting around 80 LVTZ-35 tanks. After assisting with the German invasion of Poland, the military wanted to build up its armored force, but ran into trouble with Germany not wanting to supply
Can we get some of those? 9.
supply the vehicles. Later, they did eventually secure 32 Panzer 38Ts and 21 LTVZ-40s organized into a mobile division, which they then took into the Soviet Union as part of Army Group South. But most tanks were lost by February of 1942, forcing the mobile division to be redesignated as an infantry division in August of 1943, after being virtually destroyed while fighting in Crimea. In 1944, though, as Germany became desperate for troops to hold back the inevitable, the Germans began to rebuild the Slovak army by giving them all the tanks they didn't want anymore, including Panzer 38Ts, Panzer III's Alfs N, and Panzer
No, we should.
II's Alfs F, which fought on the front until the Slovak Uprising, where many of the tanks were turned on their former master, only to be crushed by the Germans and Slovak loyalists.
Ooh, Bulgaria. All right. We had the Croatians to represent the Yugoslavians, and we had the Slovaks to just represent Czechoslovakia. And now we're going into Bulgaria. All right.
Although being allied to Germany for the majority of the war, Bulgaria refused to declare war on and send troops into the Soviet Union, leaving its largest contribution to allowing German troops a road into Greece and helping with anti-partisan actions in Yugoslavia. Owning a similarly modest tank force to the previous two, its first tanks were CV-33s and Vickers 6-tonners, purchased from Italy and Britain in the 30s, forming two tank companies assigned to two fast divisions. They added 16 Panzer 35Ts to the gang in 1940, which allowed them to create an armored brigade in 1941, with some war trophy R-35s added later by the Germans. After beginning to fight in 1940,
I just love that the Minor Axis tank meme isn't really like them developing their own tanks. It's more of them just like trying to get a hold of whatever the fuck they can.
the Germans rewarded this, overjoyed with Bulgaria finally getting into the Suicide Pact, by supplying them with around 60 Panzer IIIs and IVs. Bulgaria thanked the Germans by promptly switching sides and using their gifted tanks to fight the remainder of the war alongside the Soviets, all the way into Hungary, where they ended the
Uno
war in
reverse.
1945.
Damn. Ooh, we got the Romanians. All right.
Romania, unlike many of the countries mentioned, was actually on the Entente side of the Great War, and as a result had very good relations with its former allies in the interwar years, purchasing multiple models of French tanks, along with multiple models from Czechoslovakia, with many attempts at license production that never really panned out. However, the annexation of Czechoslovakia and the Munich crisis ended this steady supply, and new tanks were only acquired after the collapse of Poland, as the Polish 21st Armored Battalion escaped through Romania, leaving their tanks behind, boosting numbers of R-35s, and adding a handful of Polish-made tankettes, modernizing the 1st Tank Regiment and allowing the creation of a 2nd. After multiple German brokered territory losses for Romania, fascist regime took over and crawled back to Germany like a battered housewife, falling under its fear, and they right away requested more tanks from the Czech plants, requests which were promptly denied by the Germans. However, Romania still threw in behind them for the international fight against Bolshevism and contributed the most troops of any Eastern ally and one tank division that was tactically misused, resulting in large losses around Odessa. Most of these were from mechanical failure, but a good amount were lost in combat as well. By the end of 1941, the shattered tank units were sent back for overhaul and to be merged with Panzer 35Ts that Germany had finally agreed to hand over. However, it had become very clear that the Romanian tanks were wholly ineffective against their Soviet counterparts, and those that continued to be sent in had diminishing returns on their performance, doing what they could to upgun and convert outdated tanks into self-propelled guns, and took any acquisitions from the Czech plants that the Germans could approve. Later in 1943, Berlin began a rearmament effort to rebuild the 1st Armored Division and create a 2nd, selling Romania 114 Panzer IVs.
Wow.
The Red Army reached
That's
Romania in spring of 1944, and after some hard fighting over the summer, the King staged a coup in August, overthrowing the fascist government and siding with the Red Army, turning their tanks on their former masters, while also being resupplied with small numbers of T-34-85s, but still remaining primarily equipped with the vehicles of German origin.
Alright, and into Hungary. I cannot pronounce.
Hungary had the largest armored force of the Eastern Allies.
Is that we're like, you know, the Magyar, whatever. Can't pronounce that. I would pronounce them if I could. I wish I
was
could.
the only one to achieve true indigenous tank production. First buying foreign models of
footages of Italian armored corps, but the vehicles shown are of the type that made up almost all of the pre-war purchases. The images are of Hungarian service.
Similar types listed by the previous countries, and then beginning home production in 1938 with licensed copies of the Swedish L-60 named Toldi, of which there were a couple variants. Hungary took part in the invasion of Yugoslavia and Soviet Union, deploying Toldi and CV-33 tanks. It was only in 1942 that it formed its first dedicated armored brigade that later became a division with 138 Ts and 22 Panzer IV-Ds acquired from the Germans. A second
look at
division
them,
would
they have
follow,
tanks.
equipped with Hungarian Turin 1 and 2 tanks. These, however, were outgunned by the Soviet vehicles, because of course they were, leading to heavy losses in tank engagements when first deployed in the Carpathians in 1944. Despite this, the Germans were still impressed with the Hungarians' performance in combat, and invested in them to a higher degree than any other country, providing Panzer IVs, Panthers, and surprisingly, multiple
I feel like they were also they were the most loyal of the minor Axis members. Like, compared to Romania, Bulgaria. I feel like they were more loyal than the Italians.
precious Tiger tanks of Heavy Tank Battalion 503. These tanks first went into action in the summer, but by late summer had been pushed back to Hungary's eastern frontier and was sent forward after Army Group Center died in a rather hopeless attack to try to stop the
Fucking
Soviet
dead.
onslaught. Things only got worse when Romania switched sides in late August, with the Hungarians attempting to deal with them along with the Red Army for the remainder of the war, with the last major action of Hungarian tank forces revolving around the siege of Budapest and the retreat afterwards. Although invested in more by the Germans and the most successful of the Eastern European armies as far as tanks go, Hungary still faced many of the same challenges the other countries did. I know some of you are probably yelling at your screen wanting me to go into more detail because there's a lot here, but for the sake of time I'm going to move on to the last country. But I highly encourage you, if you're interested, to read some more about the Hungarian tank divisions.
Slight fake out. I planned to do Finland, but as they were not a full Axis power, I'm reserving them for a possible future video. Oh, okay. Finnish tank meme coming up.
The biggest
sometime in the
takeaway
future.
lesson from all of these very similar sounding stories is that tank production is hard. I think when talking
Yeah.
about the great powers, we often take it for granted that each country would make its own model of tank.
Yes.
And when we do, we begin to nitpick design choices and deride a vehicle if it's not the very, very best. But in reality, without a good amount of heavy industry and a large economy to support it, tank production would be very much out of reach, and you'd be reliant on a larger power to help you outfit your troops with them. And if that large power is Germany, you're pretty much Germany almost does everything it can to hinder its allies, rather than
That got me. That got
help
me.
them when it comes to this. They give their allies very outdated tanks in
Oh,
small
fuck.
numbers, if they even give them any at all. Not that the smaller countries should necessarily expect it. The Germans did this because they were having trouble fully mechanizing themselves to the level that they wanted. And although I've been making jokes this whole time, they were trying their best to prioritize and give as many vehicles to those that were fighting with them as they could. And by the end of the war, when countries were dropping like flies and joining the Soviets, they had to be getting nervous that as soon as they gave someone tanks, they might be turned back and fired at them,
Yes.
as they often were. However, there were other ways that the Germans could have helped things, but blatantly decided not to. Finland should have been the model for what the Germans did to assist their allies in this situation by re-equipping their minor allies with the hordes of Soviet tanks that they were capturing to give these countries vehicles that actually stood a good chance to destroy another Soviet vehicle. Even the BTs and T-26s would have been an upgrade for a lot of these nations, and in 1941, the Germans captured them in droves, but instead they immediately sent them back to the smelters in Germany and didn't redistribute them when their allies were hurting for tanks.
Yo,
Now, if
what the
German-
heck? That is, yeah, what the fuck, Germany? Much more effective to just fucking repurpose them and use them. That's wasting time.
hadn't done this, would they have not had the steel to create more of their own tanks? Possibly. The Germans did have shortages of steel and just about everything at various points in the conflict, but with World War II being a numbers game, I can't help but feel that this would have been helpful. Even standardizing on Soviet equipment is more standardization than the minor allies achieved. With this hodgepodge of tanks from anywhere, just please let us have some. And if Finland was used as a model, and you add some ammunition production to it, maybe you would have seen a better situation. And like all things to do with the Axis and Allies, in the final episode coming soon about the Allies miners, you will see a beautiful comparison for what to do versus this video's minor Axis nations, what not to do. Thank you to World of Tanks.
Alright, that was the minor Axis tank meme. Yeah, pretty much just a video about how the Minor Axis members needed to beg and steal tanks in order to have tank corps or even tank brigades. That was Minor Axis Tank Meme by Potential History. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.